What if I told you that one of the biggest changes in England's history started without one huge battle or one famous king? It all began when the mighty Romans packed up and left Britain behind. Suddenly, towns were empty, roads were falling apart, and nobody was really in charge. Then, new people crossed the sea looking for a fresh start, and they ended up building the England we know today. Pretty wild, right? This is where the real story begins. Alright, so imagine waking up one morning and finding out that the biggest army protecting your home has simply disappeared. That is almost exactly what happened in Britain around the year 410 AD. For nearly 400 years, the Romans had ruled the island. They built roads that stretched for miles, huge stone walls, busy towns, strong forts, bridges, bathhouses, and marketplaces where people from all over the empire came to trade. Roman soldiers stood guard along the borders, and Roman officials collected taxes while making sure laws were followed. Life was far from perfect, but there was order. People knew who was in charge, and they believed someone would come if danger appeared. Then everything changed. The Roman Empire was falling apart because it was under attack from many different directions across Europe. The emperors no longer had enough soldiers or money to defend every part of the empire. Britain was far away from Rome, and keeping thousands of soldiers there became too expensive. So one day, the order came for the Roman army to leave Britain and return to protect the empire itself. The ships sailed away carrying trained soldiers who had defended the island for generations. Many local people watched from the shore, probably believing the Romans would come back soon. They never did. That moment left Britain standing completely on its own for the first time in centuries. Look, that was a really big deal. Okay, so once the Romans were gone, the problem started almost right away. Roman governors were no longer making decisions. Taxes stopped being collected the old way. Soldiers were gone from many forts. Large towns that had once been full of traders slowly became quieter every year. Roads that Roman workers had carefully repaired began to break apart because nobody was maintaining them anymore. Big public buildings slowly fell into ruin as roofs collapsed and walls cracked. Some people stayed in the old Roman towns, but many families left and moved into the countryside where it was easier to grow food and stay safe. Britain did not fall apart in one single year. It happened slowly. Every season, things became a little harder. Every winter, people had to solve more problems on their own. Without a strong government watching over everything, local leaders had to protect their own lands. Different groups competed for power, and nobody was strong enough to control the whole island. Life became uncertain in ways most people had never experienced before. One generation had grown up under Roman peace, while the next had to learn how to survive without it. That changed everything. Yeah, so when the Romans left, they did not leave behind another government ready to take over. They simply left a huge space where power used to be. Local British leaders suddenly had to make big decisions on their own. Some had once worked with Roman officials, but now they were responsible for protecting entire communities without Roman soldiers standing beside them. Imagine trying to defend your town when the strongest army in the world had just packed up and sailed away. That was the reality. Every leader had to figure things out with whatever people and supplies they had. Some built wooden walls around villages. Others gathered local fighters who were really just farmers holding spears instead of trained soldiers. People looked to anyone who seemed brave enough to keep them alive. In times like these, loyalty mattered more than fancy titles. That was the beginning of a completely different Britain. Alright, so the trouble did not stop with losing the Romans. Groups from across the sea had already heard that Britain was rich. It had good farmland, rivers full of fish, forests for hunting, and towns filled with useful stone buildings. Once word spread that Roman soldiers were gone, many people saw an opportunity. Pirates began attacking the coast more often. Raiders landed from small ships, stole animals, food, tools, and anything else they could carry, then disappeared before local fighters could stop them. Coastal villages started living in fear. Families kept watch at night, wondering if strange ships would appear before sunrise. Parents probably told their children to stay close because danger could arrive at any moment. Life became about surviving one season at a time. Do not let that fool you. These constant attacks slowly changed the future of Britain. Look, one of the biggest threats came from the north. The Picts, who lived in what is now Scotland, had been fighting the Romans for years. They knew Britain was weaker now. Without Roman forts filled with soldiers, crossing into British lands became much easier. At the same time, Irish raiders from the west also launched attacks along the coastline. They were looking for food, animals, treasure, and sometimes even people to take away as slaves. Communities had to defend themselves from more than one direction at once. Imagine hearing that enemies could arrive from the sea, from the mountains, or from nearby lands all within the same week. Nobody felt completely safe anymore. Every sunrise could bring another fight. That was the new normal. But many stories from this time were never written down because Britain was entering what historians sometimes call the Dark Ages. That name does not mean people were less smart. It simply means very few written records survived. The Romans had kept detailed records about taxes, laws, soldiers, and leaders. After they left, much less was written. People were focused on staying alive instead of writing books. Most of what we know today comes from later writers, old poems, buried villages, broken weapons, jewelry, graves, and things discovered by archaeologists. Every small object found in the ground helps fill another missing piece of the story. It is almost like putting together a giant puzzle with half the pieces missing. Pretty wild, right? Yeah, so, one famous story from this time talks about a British leader named Vortigern. According to later traditions, he was struggling to protect his people from constant attacks. He needed experienced fighters, and his own men were not enough. So he looked across the North Sea for help. There were skilled warriors living in places that are now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. These people belonged to different groups, including the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Vortigern is said to have invited some of them to Britain as hired soldiers. The deal sounded simple: fight for Britain, receive land and payment in return. Honestly, it probably seemed like a smart plan at first. But sometimes the biggest problems begin with what looks like the easiest solution. Look, these warriors were excellent fighters. They knew how to battle with swords, shields, spears, and axes. Many had spent their whole lives fighting over land back home. Britain looked different to them. It had open farmland, rivers, forests, and places where families could settle. Once they arrived, they realized this island offered more than just temporary work. They saw a chance to build a completely new life. Some brought wives and children later. Others encouraged relatives to come across the sea too. Little by little, what started as a few groups of hired soldiers slowly became permanent settlements. Nobody could have guessed just how much that decision would change England forever. All right, so, the people we now call the Anglo-Saxons were not one single tribe. That surprises a lot of people. They were actually several different groups with different backgrounds. The Angles gave England its very name. The Saxons became powerful in the south. The Jutes settled mainly in Kent and nearby areas. Even though they had differences, they shared many customs, spoke similar languages, and believed in many of the same gods. Over time, they mixed together, married, traded, fought side by side, and slowly built new communities across Britain. What began as separate groups slowly turned into something much bigger, and that bigger story was only just getting started. So here is the thing. The first Anglo-Saxon settlements were nothing like the big Roman towns they found. The Romans had built places with stone streets, public baths, huge villas, and walls that could last for centuries. The newcomers did not try to copy that life. Instead, they built small villages close to rivers, forests, and good farmland. Most homes were made from wood, with roofs covered in straw. They were simple, but worked well. Families lived together with their animals nearby because protecting livestock meant protecting their future. Every village depended on farming, fishing, hunting, and raising animals. Life was hard, but it was built around the land instead of the city. That simple way of living shaped England for hundreds of years. Alright, so farming became the center of almost everything. Most people woke up before sunrise and worked until the light disappeared. Men cleared forests, plowed fields, repaired fences, and cared for animals. Women cooked meals, made clothes, looked after children, prepared food for winter, and handled many jobs around the home. Kids started helping as soon as they were old enough to carry tools or watch sheep. There were no weekends or vacations. If crops failed, everyone suffered. If winter lasted too long, food became scarce. Every season brought new challenges, and survival depended on working together. Look, every single harvest could decide whether a family lived comfortably or went hungry. Yeah, so these villages were led by local chiefs who earned respect by protecting their people. A chief who could win battles, settle arguments, and reward loyal followers usually stayed in power. A weak leader could lose everything very quickly. People expected their leader to be brave enough to stand in front during a fight, not hide behind everyone else. Warriors promised loyalty to their chief, and in return, they expected gifts, land, food, and protection. That bond was personal. It was built on trust, not paperwork. If a chief failed his people, many warriors simply left to follow someone stronger. Leadership had to be earned every single day. Look, fighting was a normal part of life. Small kingdoms argued over farmland, rivers, forests, and trade routes. Sometimes battles happened because one leader wanted more land. Other times it was about revenge after a raid or the theft of animals. Most battles were much smaller than people imagine. They were not giant clashes with thousands of soldiers. Often, they were groups of local warriors meeting in open fields or near rivers. Spears were common because they were easier to make than swords. Shields were just as important as weapons because staying alive mattered more than looking brave. Every fight carried huge risks because losing meant more than defeat. It could mean losing your home, your land, or even your family. Okay, so even though life was dangerous, these people were skilled builders and craftsmen. Blacksmiths worked with iron to make knives, axes, spearheads, and farming tools. Woodworkers built houses, boats, carts, and furniture. Women created beautiful jewelry using glass beads, bronze, silver, and sometimes even gold. We know this because archaeologists have found incredible burial sites filled with carefully made objects. These discoveries show that Anglo-Saxon people cared about beauty as much as survival. They decorated weapons, cups, belts, and clothing with detailed designs that still amaze people today. Do not let their simple villages fool you. Their craftsmanship was incredibly impressive. Yeah, so religion was also a huge part of daily life before Christianity spread across England. The early Anglo-Saxons believed in many gods connected to nature, war, wisdom, and fate. Some of the names might even sound familiar because several days of the week come from these old gods. Wednesday is linked to Woden, who was seen as a wise and powerful god. Thursday comes from Thunor, the god of thunder. Friday is connected to Frigg, a goddess associated with family and love. People believed these gods could influence battles, harvests, weather, and even personal luck. Sacred trees, springs, hills, and forests were often treated as special places where people prayed or made offerings. Nature itself felt alive with power. That belief shaped how they saw the entire world. Alright, so stories were just as important as books because very few people could read or write. Long before bedtime stories became a tradition, families gathered around fires to hear tales about brave heroes, clever leaders, scary monsters, magical creatures, and great battles. Skilled storytellers could keep a whole hall silent for hours. These stories passed history, family traditions, and important lessons from one generation to the next. Every child grew up hearing about courage, loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. Those stories helped people remember who they were and where they came from. In many ways, stories became the history books of Anglo-Saxon England. And those stories would shape the identity of a nation that was still being born. Look, as more Anglo-Saxon families crossed the North Sea, Britain slowly began to change in ways nobody could have imagined. At first, only a few ships arrived every now and then. Then more followed. Entire families started making the journey instead of just groups of fighters. They brought children, farming tools, animals, seeds, and everything they needed to build a new life. These people were not planning to earn a little money and go home. They wanted land they could call their own. Forests were cleared to make room for fields. Small villages grew larger every year. New farms appeared where there had once been empty land. The landscape itself started to look different. What had been Roman Britain was slowly becoming Anglo-Saxon England. That change did not happen overnight, but year after year it became impossible to ignore. All right, so, not everyone welcomed these newcomers. The native Britons had already lived on the island for generations, and many were determined to protect their homes. Some local leaders gathered fighters and pushed back against the settlements. Other communities made peace and traded with the newcomers. In some places, the two groups fought for years. In others, they lived side by side, married each other, and slowly blended their customs. History is rarely as simple as one side completely replacing another. It was a long and messy process with battles, friendships, betrayals, and new beginnings all happening at the same time. Every part of Britain experienced these changes a little differently. That is what makes this period so fascinating. Yeah, so, language was changing too. The Britons mostly spoke Celtic languages, while the newcomers spoke different Germanic languages that sounded very different. At first, people probably struggled to understand one another. Imagine trying to trade food or settle an argument when you barely shared any words. Over time, though, languages mixed in certain places. The speech of the Angles and Saxons slowly became what we now call Old English. If you heard it today, you probably would not understand much of it. It sounded completely different from modern English. Still, many everyday words we use now have their roots in that language. Words like house, wife, bread, water, and friend come from those early Anglo-Saxon speakers. Pretty amazing when you think about it. The words you use every day carry a history that is over 1,500 years old. Okay, so place names across England also began to change. Whenever the newcomers built a village, they often gave it a name in their own language. That is why so many places in England today end with words like ham, meaning home, tun, meaning settlement, or bury, meaning a fortified place. Every one of those names tells a little story about the people who first lived there. Even after centuries passed, those names survived. Modern maps still carry the fingerprints of those early settlers. Every road sign becomes a tiny piece of history if you know what to look for. That is a pretty cool reminder that the past never really disappears. Look, one thing that made the Anglo-Saxons successful was their ability to adapt. They did not simply destroy everything the Romans had built. In many places, they reused old Roman roads because they were still the fastest way to travel. They sometimes lived near abandoned Roman towns or used stone from old buildings to create something new. Broken Roman walls became building material. Old forts became useful shelters. Wells continued to provide fresh water long after Roman officials were gone. Even though Roman rule had ended, parts of Roman life quietly lived on. The newcomers built their own future while standing on the remains of the old one. History has a funny way of working like that. Yeah, so, as villages grew into larger communities, local leaders became more ambitious. A chief who controlled one village wanted 2. A leader with 2 villages wanted 5. Before long, small territories started joining together under stronger rulers. These early kingdoms were still tiny compared to modern countries, but they were becoming more organized every year. Leaders collected food, gathered warriors, settled disputes, and protected trade routes. People slowly began to think of themselves as belonging to one ruler instead of just one village. That shift may sound small, but it laid the foundation for future kingdoms. Big nations almost always begin with small communities finding reasons to stand together. All right, so, despite all the fighting, everyday life never stopped. Children were still born, farmers still planted crops every spring. Families still celebrated weddings, mourned loved ones, shared meals, and gathered around fires on cold nights. Merchants carried goods between villages, fishermen headed out before sunrise, blacksmiths kept shaping iron with hammer and fire. Most people were not famous warriors or powerful chiefs. They were ordinary people, trying to build a better future for their families. Their names may be forgotten, but without them, there would have been no England to remember. Sometimes the biggest changes in history are built by people whose names never appear in a single book.